Okay, let's get started. Thank you all for being here and welcome to Iowa Ideas In-Depth Week. This is the second day of In-Depth Week for us. I'm Olivia Cohen. I'm the Energy and Environment Reporter with the Gazette, and I'll be moderating today's session titled The Health Impacts of Extreme Weather and How It's Affecting Iowa. Just for a quick overview of Iowa Ideas, this is our 9th year of Iowa Ideas, and it's an event that explores topics that are important to Iowans across the state. So we're excited for more great discussions this week, specifically focusing on how extreme weather impacts the state of Iowa. A quick thank you to our sponsors for this event. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, ICT Midwest. Our sponsors support help us make Iowa Ideas sessions and discussions free for all Iowans. So thank you to them. Just a quick note for our attendees as well. You'll be able to submit questions to our two panelists today through your Zoom box. So if any questions pop up for you, feel free to send them our way and I will incorporate them into our conversation and ask our experts. Just for a quick few introductions here. Again, this session is addressing the health impacts of extreme weather. And today we have two great panelists joining us, Cody Smith, the Director of Climate Initiatives with the Iowa Environmental Council, and Aubrey Miller, the Senior Medical Advisor for the National Institutes of Health. And I will quickly pass it to both of them to introduce themselves a little bit more and to give us a little bit more insight into their work. Aubrey, would you like to start?
Sure, be happy to. And thank you for having us here and to discuss this really important topic about health and extreme weather and how it's affecting Iowans and across the country and our communities. So I'm excited to be here. So I am actually at the National Institutes, and my institute is the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, otherwise known as NIEHS. And we focus on how does the environment affect human health. And we do all sorts of research and fund research across the United States to try to understand those questions in our populations. I am an occupational and environmental physician. I serve as a medical advisor and work on different programs, particularly focused on extreme weather, disasters, and then supporting how we think about and try to develop this area of environmental health across the country and try to create the next generation of researchers and public health folks that are going to help assist us in this space. So I'm happy to be here again, and I'll turn it over to my colleague here, Cody.
Well, thanks, Aubrey, and thanks for having me, Olivia. I'm excited for the topic today and the discussion. My name is Cody Smith. I serve as the Director of Climate Initiatives at the Iowa Environmental Council. A little bit more about our organization. We've been around for 30 years. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, and we exist to build a just, sustainable, and healthy environment for Iowans, current and generations to come. And I lead our Climate Initiatives program, which is our newest program. We've traditionally started as a clean water org, started a clean energy program in the mid-2000s, and then we started our Climate Initiatives program last year. This program is laser focused on helping Iowans in the communities they call home adapt to the impacts of climate change and protect their health from both extreme weather and pollution in the environment. So as I heard Aubrey talk about his role, he's kind of on the medical side of it, and I'm sort of on the local implementation and advising side of it here on the ground in Iowa. So really excited to share more about our experiences as we've lifted and launched this work over the past year, and talk more about how Iowans can protect themselves and their communities from the impacts of extreme weather on their health. Thanks for having me, Olivia.
Absolutely. Thank you both. Just to jump right into a few questions here, just to start generally for you both, what are some of these extreme weather events that can really impact human health? And are there specific events that Iowans and also people across the country should be aware of or be on the lookout for with how it impacts their health? Would either of you like to start on that?
Cody, you want to give a start, and then I'll back you up.
Yeah, I can do that. Thank you. I think we're both being polite. Well, I've just mentioned a couple of things. Some of these events are not new to Iowa, but they are getting more intense and they're happening more frequently for the most part. So I'll just mention a couple that I think that we focus on quite a bit for our work here at IEC, beginning with extreme heat. This year has been one of those where we've had several extreme heat waves, and we had a heat dome, and it lasted several days, and it's just really intense. So what we're seeing is those are getting more intense, they're lasting longer, and they're happening earlier in the season than they typically do, which is fueled by climate change. And we also focus on tornadoes and extreme wind events, which is happening more commonly. Obviously, we're no stranger to derechos, and we saw the nation's third strongest tornado by wind speed in Greenfield last year. And then the other one that we think about a lot is flooding. There are plenty of other different types of things to focus on when it comes to extreme weather. But when we're here talking about the things here in Iowa, those are the top three that we're most concerned with because they happen most frequently and they're the most intense. There are so many ways that these events are impacting Iowans, whether it's the flooding up in Spencer, which I'm sure I'll talk about again, or that Greenfield tornado. Cedar Rapids is no stranger to flooding as well, as we all know. But there's plenty of opportunities for Iowans to be impacted by extreme weather, but those are the ones that we're most focused on. Anything to add to that, Aubrey?
Yeah, and thanks, Cody. I think you hit the nail on the head in many ways, and I think we have to be considering other changes that may be happening or that we're seeing more and more. It's things like wildfire smoke, which is affecting Iowans and many others across the nation, and that becomes increasingly complicated. And that may be on top of a situation, right? So we may have flooding, and you may have a hot day, and you may also have bad air coming through from wildfire smoke or something else. So I think we have to think about the complexity of these situations coming together. Heat is certainly one that is really catching a lot of attention, and we're seeing that all over the country in extreme heat waves. And that's affecting a lot of our communities, and it's also affecting, indirectly other things. And I know we'll come back to questions about kind of the indirect effects of some of these extreme weather events too. But I think we need to be thinking about not only what we're experiencing acutely, but also some of the changes that we may be seeing. Another thing that we're watching and being concerned about is how different types of infectious agents, mosquitoes or ticks, are changing patterns around the country and bringing different disease patterns to our folks. I know West Nile virus is an issue from ticks and mosquitoes from ehrlichiosis and tick disease issues. So we need to be thinking about how things may be changing for Iowans in the days to come, as well as the acute events that we see.
Absolutely. Thank you both. I'm curious, are there any extreme weather events that you see that are a little bit under the radar in terms of what's covered in the news or what's talked about in scientific circles? Are there any events that, should be, boosted in these conversations?
I'll talk about some of the hidden impacts of extreme heat to start. I think when people experience an extreme heat wave, it's just sort of inconvenient to a lot of people, but there are many Iowans where that's not the case. I actually just last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago now, looked at the number of heat-related emergency department visits in the state of Iowa. And what we've seen is that number has been increasing steadily since the state started tracking that in 2003. In fact, if you exclude 2020, which was a weird year for the pandemic and people being at home more often, Iowa's rate of emergency department visits has been above average since 2016, and it's growing. And so these are people that are not necessarily just outside working or other things like that, but they are just experiencing acute heat-related illnesses that drive them to visit the emergency department. And this is over 1,000 Iowans every year that this happens to. In fact, it's climbed to almost 2,000 over the last couple of years. So, a lot of folks experience this weather in different ways. And so I think what I would focus on is some of the hidden impacts of the more widespread things. Even flooding, for example, having worked with some communities responding and recovering from flooding, they often describe a scenario where the health impacts after the acute event, after the flood itself, are inside the home. You don't see them from the street. You don't see the mold that's in the drywall. You don't see the respiratory illness resulting from that. So there are definitely some lingering effects and really harmful effects from heat, floods, and other things that are really hard to see unless you're the one experiencing them. And there are so many Iowans, whether they have existing chronic illnesses like COPD and it's air quality related, or lung cancer. We know we have a cancer crisis in the state. There are so many Iowans that have different levels of vulnerability, and that can sometimes be lost in this conversation.
Yeah, and I guess I would add, and to Cody's comments, think about like who's at risk, right? And what kind of needs do they have? Do they have access to medical care services? If something happens in the town and interrupts that or interrupts their ability to get their medications, or they may be on home oxygen, so they're at acute risk. And then there's this longer tail that Cody was talking about too. What happens after the acute situation changes, right? And we're moving to recovery, and what do folks need on top of their acute health situation? You mentioned heat stress, Cody, and again, we're seeing, like you said, rises in the emergency departments. People having increased difficulty of cooling their homes. We saw a huge outbreak of people getting sick and even and fatal in Canada because the homes really weren't prepared for cooling, and the nighttime temperatures are rising and staying high. So we're seeing that type of effect in the United States as well, and we're seeing that people also are sensitive to heat, like you mentioned, but may not show up in the emergency department very clearly, but their medications are affected, right? So people on certain types of medications are sensitive. And you need to be able to talk with your doctor, and they need to be able to think about, the temperature's going up. Do I need to adjust somebody's medication? Do I need to think about how that may be affecting, their health and outcomes, et cetera, in different ways? So we all know how sensitive our aging population can be, particularly, and on different types of medications and different types of needs. So there's a lot of elements. I would also pick up on the mold issue. That's one that, Olivia mentioned is overlooked. And, we run in and we clean things up, and sometimes people will wear masks or try to be cognizant. And a lot of times, even in the cleanup effort, you get exposed to chemicals and clean up things that may cause problems itself. Chlorine is also a dangerous compound for cleanup. But those types of issues, we don't really, we know people may get sick, and some people are more susceptible to others, or they may become sensitized. So then they'll have longer effects after a while. And we've seen that in a number of instances where someone may get exposed to high degree of something like mold and then continues to have kind of chronic health effects. So we need to be thinking about those types of things too that don't show up acutely like in the emergency department. And typically we see a lot of injuries at first, and as Cody mentioned, respiratory, maybe cardiovascular, people with heart attacks, and some of the acute changes. But these longer term things can go on for a long time, and they're generally not seen very well, but they are affecting our communities and folks like in Spencer that Cody mentioned, and other areas that have really high levels of flooding and kind of trauma.
Yeah, and Olivia, I would just add one thing based on your question overall. What's overlooked? What events might not be discussed? There are some that are newer that have become an emerging challenge for the state of Iowa. Aubrey mentioned the wildfire smoke, but wildfires themselves here, the federal data that I've seen show that Iowa is high risk for wildfires, and particularly the western grassland area near the Les Hills and south central parts of the state. That is something that we often rank in the 80th or 75th or even 90th percentile nationally for our wildfire risk over the next 30 years. So this is something that we're seeing more of on a smaller scale. Some grassland fires around the Des Moines Metro over the last year. I was driving on I-80 about a year ago, and there was a grass fire along the ditches near Council Bluffs. So, this is something that's emerging that we'll have to consider more in our future as well.
And there's one other item. We'll jump in for a second. I'll give you another question. But drought is a big issue, right? And of the 86 or so $1 billion disasters in Iowa in the last 24 or maybe 40 years, I think, about 16 of those were drought. And people think about the impacts of drought, and not only on the crops, but on human health and nutrition, and then these other items that how they may contribute to wildfires or changing vectors of disease.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. I'd like to circle back to something that you mentioned a few minutes ago, Aubrey, talking about who is most at risk. You mentioned the aging population, people who take certain medications that could be affected by extreme heat. But I'm curious, with other extreme weather events, what other demographics of people, and in Iowa, Cody, maybe you could speak on this, are most at risk?
Do you want me to start, or Cody?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
All right, so I'll take that start. And Cody, you did allude to it, and the issue about workers, right? How are our workers and people that are outside and in the fields and doing different types of labor, and the evolution of that labor changing? How will they be affected? Clearly, heat is a huge and upfront consideration for our worker populations, as well as smoke and other things that are maybe coming more and more into play. Of course, kids, right? So we're always thinking about our kids and the type of environment that they continue to grow up in. And I would also say, like a situation like in Spencer, or the huge flooding events that have been across Iowa through the years, and even the smaller ones that are occurring, it displaces a lot of pollutants. It displaces situations. This is agrochemical communities with farm chemicals and all sorts of different types of products. Those get transported to different locations. They may end up in drinking water. They may end up in recreation waters. They may end up into well systems. Or may contaminate surfaces like school grounds and things. So we need to be thinking about, as these events occur, what are some of the downstream impacts and for whom, right? So kids tend to be on the ground. They tend to be playing a lot in the soils and surfaces around the school grounds or around backyards. And then we think about the foods and things that we're eating, and how are those maybe not only changing, but also the contribution of some of the environmental changes and pollutants that may be showing up in these products. So we should be thinking about different populations, especially ones that are at risk. But pregnant mothers have already shown that exposure to heat, exposure to traumatic events has consequences for babies and for the outcomes of childbirth. And so we need to be thinking about that population particularly. And as we started to talk a little bit more deeply about people that have ongoing health conditions, particularly people with respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune complications, all sorts of things that make them vulnerable to new types of exposures or experiences. Even the traumatic experiences and the mental health impacts are a really major consideration to be thinking about.
Yeah, I would say that Aubrey did a great job of encompassing the different classes of folks that are most at risk. Just to repeat some of them: pregnant women, children, the elderly, folks with existing chronic illness. And also, I would just add to that list, folks who don't have health insurance and access to preventative care. That's something we've seen a lot of. And those examples are evident all across the state in some heartbreaking ways. One thing that's on my mind, we have a cancer and environmental risk factors project in Iowa right now. One of the reasons we're having a listening session in Tama tomorrow in partnership with the Meskwaki Nation is they don't show up that high on incidence rates comparative with the rest of the counties in the state from Tama County, but they show up higher on mortality. And so to me, that says a narrative about cultural, economic, and social systems and how they have access to either preventative care or access to treatment. Those sort of things are really complicated, and they can help us understand which communities are more or less prepared to respond to these challenges. Another example that I'm thinking about from central Iowa, we're all very familiar with the conversation around nitrates this summer. Extreme heat makes all of these things, they're a multiplier, right? Extreme heat or flood, for example, extreme heat can cause an increase in harmful algal blooms, and that will produce microcystins, which is the toxin from that. And unlike nitrates, it doesn't have a legally required maximum contaminant level under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And we've already had examples where the Des Moines River was completely unusable as a drinking water source from that for Des Moines Waterworks. So what happens when this happens more and our other options are limited based on drought and extreme heat together? Let's say the Des Moines River gets to that point again. Well, then the Raccoon is too low and it's high in nitrate. And then the Saylorville Reservoir has a E. coli advisory or some other thing that's going on that makes it not a suitable blending source of water. The people that are most at risk for that are people that, again, are most vulnerable. So thinking the nitrate issue, it's pregnant women, it's children. It's the same thing with microcystin and others. So, these are multiplying events. And I think that we have to really have a comprehensive view of how these extremes, which is our new normal, whether it's water resources or heat or extreme weather, these types of things really impact our infrastructure, and infrastructure exists to serve people, right? Roads, bridges, the energy grid, water infrastructure. And so who has the least amount of resources and is most at risk for that is what I try to focus on in the work that I'm doing across the state with public health agencies, emergency managers, local elected officials, and even state lawmakers. Because there are so many Iowans, whether it's in Waterloo and formerly redline communities, or in Davenport, where the asthma rate in the southeast side of the city is among the highest in the state, second only to Woodbury County and Sioux City. And they have some of the worst air pollution in the state when it comes to particulate matter pollution. So all of these things get either less bad or more bad with some of the extremes that we see. And that is something we can't lose sight of in this conversation.
And just to add, and we should be cognizant that it's not just folks that are vulnerable. These populations, totally healthy adults that have been fine will be susceptible to these challenges when you're exposed. As a matter of fact, I had drinking water from a harmful algal bloom that was unbeknownst to folks that were in Toledo, Ohio one day, and the drinking water system had been contaminated with a harmful algal bloom, and a lot of folks got stomach illness. So it's just if these situations occur, and as we know they will, not only will the vulnerable populations, but everybody else will also have effects.
Yeah, just to add on a personal story to that, Aubrey, 2015, I was on Saylorville Reservoir here in the Des Moines Metro, and they had an E. coli advisory I was not aware of. I was staying with some friends with some dogs. I have an allergy to dogs, so I was rubbing my eyes a lot, got some lake water in it, and I developed an ulcer in my eye and almost lost vision in my right eye. And so that's a story that we hear across central Iowa. There's somebody from the, I believe, Waukee area that's currently hospitalized or was recently with waterborne illness. And so this is something that does impact Iowans all over the state. And it's not just to those that are most vulnerable, but it's really anybody who comes in contact with the environment in a state like that.
Yeah, a lot of people go, well, I don't have any of those issues, but yes, you're still at risk, and depending where you are and the circumstances, absolutely.
That's a good segue into my next question here. For the average Iowan, or beyond Iowa as well, what is something that an individual or a household can do to, try to mitigate these effects of extreme weather and how that could impact their health? Is there anything that an individual could do on their own to help that?
I mean, I'm happy to start, Aubrey.
Please do.
One of the things I think about is, I think one of the most successful strategies that you'll hear about, that you'll read about, and that you'll see in practice is to know your neighbors, as silly as that sounds, but knowing the people that live around you, whether it's in a multifamily building, like an apartment building, or a single family home, your neighborhood. Because when a flood strikes, when a heat wave strikes and your power goes out, if you know that your neighbor is somebody who is a lung cancer patient and requires a respiratory machine of some sort to sustain their life, then you know that power outage means a lot more to them acutely in that moment than it would to maybe others on your street. So you can help them. And then vice versa. If you've got a scenario where you rely on dialysis and you have to have that machinery going at that time and the power goes out, people know that they need to help you immediately. Whether that's just your immediate neighbors or even working with your local elected officials to make sure that you know where you can go to access clean water, reliable electricity. We've done some work across the state with some communities and hoping to do more of it to establish places that are more well-known for people to go during those times. So it's not a surprise where that might pop up post-event. And I would say there are some other individual health actions. Making sure you're being cognizant of how hot it is outside, especially, I think Friday is going to be another blazing hot day. It seems like every Friday we've had over the last couple of weeks is, I'm like, oh, I'm so ready to get outside. And then it's like 100+ degrees with the heat index. So, drinking plenty of water, making sure that, that water is clean when you're drinking it, staying hydrated, staying involved and up to date on weather alerts is also another one I would add to that. So there's plenty of opportunities there. And I guess I would add one more is to encourage and participate in any planning efforts for preparedness in your community, whether that's a watershed planning effort or a community heat response, whatever that might look like. Finding the people that are doing that work in your community and getting involved is really crucial. Aubrey?
Yeah, thanks, Cody. And I would just echo, have a plan, right? And think about it and be intentional about it. What do I need? Do I need to have certain medications? Do I need to have a list of certain kinds of things? Who to contact? All those types of things. People need to be prepared, and we generally are not well prepared, especially in places that don't see hurricanes and things all the time. But you have Iowa gets incredibly severe storms, and they are not infrequent. Tornadoes are not infrequent. You're really at risk, and these can pop up almost any time. So you really need to think about, what do I need if I need to leave the house? What information do I need to have with me? What types of other accessories may I need to have with me? So have that plan. Know where you're going to get information from. As Cody mentioned, who are your local purveyors of information? What, in an emergency, who would I listen to? Where do I tune in? How do I get that type of information? And then think about the area that you're in terms of, what are the hazards? To be cognizant of the types of, are you near a storage facility? Are you near a train track? Think about the types of hazards, your ability to get from point A to point B if need be, and what that might look like, where areas of flooding may occur. And then, that's kind of the immediate go bag. But I always think about, and have recommendations. People just think about the environment that you live and be ready to have questions about the health and safety of that environment, even before and after. How do I know, that where my kids play or where my pets, are at, or even livestock, etc. How do I know that's safe? All those types of things, to be thinking about that general environment and the safety and well-being of that environment with your community. As Cody said, I can't overemphasize the understanding of community and community services that are available. Whether it's a cooling center, if that's available, where would you go to that cooling center? How would you get access to it? How do you get transportation, etc.? And those healthcare providers.
Absolutely. Kind of going off of that, I'm curious, you both mentioned this from kind of the individual household to the neighborhood level, but how can communities engage their local governments to have plans in place for extreme weather events when they occur? And what should these relationships look like? And Cody, could you also speak to, are there any communities or cities throughout Iowa that have done this successfully? Any success stories?
Yeah, I think it's really critical that our local communities have tailored preparedness plans for all of the things that we just talked about. There are so many dedicated professionals across the state of Iowa that care about public health, that care about emergency management, they care about the communities they serve. And my job, as I see it, is to help them have the information that they need to make these plans. So there are some examples I can think of specifically. Watershed planning is really important for making sure that you understand your watershed. And what I mean by that is some watersheds, the solution to flooding can be infrastructure, like gray infrastructure, right? Like you build a better storm drain system, you build a better corridor along the river. That's kind of that cement and, storm drains and gray infrastructure is what we call it. And it's a built environment. And then there are other places like Spencer. The only way to fix those issues are to invest in what we call natural infrastructure. And those would be with wetlands, retention ponds, vegetated buffers, restoring the native floodplain and, restoring the native vegetation within it. That's really the only cost-effective and pragmatic solution up there. And they'll tell you that themselves. And they've told me in person. And they've actually testified that to the state capitol as well. And there are some places that have done a lot of great work. I think Cedar Rapids is a really good example. There are some great examples in Des Moines too, but after the floods of 2008 in particular, the Iowa Watershed Approach Project was a great way to look at the watershed as a whole and figure out where the problem areas are, where the opportunities are, brought together a whole group of stakeholders. There's some infrastructure for doing that if you're a community leader kind of thinking about that. One example is a watershed authority, which is a completely voluntary group and partnership on a watershed boundary of cities, counties, and soil and water conservation, districts at that watershed scale. And they exist to prevent flooding and improve water quality and allocate federal or state dollars that might come in for planning, for practices, and all of those different things. There are, I believe, 27 of them, don't quote me on the number, across the state. And some of them are, doing a lot of great work. Many of them are. And that includes those up in Northeast Iowa. I know Dubuque, for example, has had a great success with their B branch flood mitigation project. Spencer, when I was talking with them just last week, a week ago today, actually, I met with the city folks there. They were saying we need a river system plan, is how they put it. That's a watershed plan, right? The communities upstream and downstream of them don't coordinate on these. So I think there's a lot of examples of what's going right. I will say that one thing that we need to do better of as a state is to give our local communities the resources they need to thrive. On the watershed example, it's coordinators, funding those coordinators, giving more resources to planning and preparedness. And then I have a project now I'm working with Davenport, Dubuque, and Muscatine on the impact of this extreme weather we've been talking about on health in their communities and how they plan for that. Our state has no program that's comprehensive to provide that information to communities, and we're trying our best to get that out there, but I'm learning from it as we go, and I really applaud those communities and the other ones I mentioned for the work that they're doing to this point. So clearly this is the part I'm very passionate about, so I'll just kick it over to Aubrey instead of taking up more time. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Cody, and great answer, especially giving the kind of the local understanding of what can be done. And you were focusing a lot on hydrology and water, but I would really encourage folks to be proactive and think really outside the box in their communities of what are the hazards, what are the risks, and to really team with your emergency managers in public health. They're already, as Cody said, probably understaffed and overworked for a lot of things that they try to keep up with, right? And they really need the community to be part of the solution and to be asking the questions to help them think it through and to try to derive answers together. And we've done workshops, training workshops around the country in different cities and different communities, and trying to bring folks together. And just as much as just putting our questions on the table from everybody's perspective and seeing what are the questions, how do we answer them, what information's available or not available that we need to go look into, and thinking about other partners into this process of emergency management, community engagement to try to address these issues. The local universities, and that's our partners. We fund universities, NIH funds universities and hospitals and researchers across the country. We have in Iowa, I think, over about 400 active grants, $200 million, and University of Iowa Environmental Health Research Center is one that our institute funds, and they're doing research on wildfires and flooding and health outcomes and different respiratory diseases. So just thinking about other partners that could be helpful, that have scientific skills or capacity to help with thinking through these issues and what might be the concerns and dangers and risks involved. So I really encourage communities to think about how do I be involved, but also just asking the simple question, what are my questions? What are my concerns? Where do I bring those to? Start small and ask those questions and think, well, maybe emergency managers may not have the answer, but some of the others might, the scientists or other agencies and departments, and just try to think how we can work together to do that. And I think that's increasingly more and more where we're heading in the country as we move toward more state and local responsibility.
Yeah, and I would just add one quick thing. I mentioned this earlier at a place where you know that the water is going to stay clean and drinkable, and you know the power is going to stay on. These are often referred to as community resilience hubs. I think that I've seen them work best in partnership with emergency managers and public health. That way all the resources are sort of in place for that. Because sometimes it can be a building like a church that has a solar array and storage, and they can keep that on regardless of what's going on at the grid level, or that's a microgrid setup. Those sorts of things take a lot of different players, from utilities to emergency managers, public health, but they also almost always start at the community level. A church leader, a community leader, just a business person, anybody who's impacted in that community almost always is the start of those conversations, whether it's through a nonprofit partner, you name it. And so if that's something of interest to you and your community, that's something you can get started. And again, it's called a community resilience hub. So you can find a lot of resources available for that.
Absolutely. Kind of on the other side of that question, you both talked quite a bit about, how to engage your community in terms of planning for severe weather events and extreme weather. But I'm curious, what should those conversations and relationships look like in terms of dealing with the aftermath of extreme weather? Is it similar to the planning, or is it different in your perspective?
Maybe I'll start, and then Cody, you can jump in. So it's really important to start before the event, right? So then you have relationships. When you're trying to meet people subsequent to an event and figure out where we stand and what to do is always the hardest and always the most problematic. So if you can start before an event, and even if it's just getting to know different folks in your community, different types of resources, and just to have those connections and relationships is such an incredible part. And just to give you an example, we held a conversation, was a training workshop in Houston in 2015 to discuss what might happen in Houston area and in the ship channel there if a hurricane was to hit. And it was just a one-day workshop where we brought together police and fire, community public health responders, universities, state and local officials. And we just talked about the different areas and issues of concern and who gets data and what kind of information do different folks need. Subsequent to that meeting, they just kept those relationships. They kept talking to each other. And when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston 2 years later, they still had those relationships. And in that circumstance, the academic universities quickly partnered with the public health to help them get data about where the risks were and checking school playgrounds and information, as well as going back to communities that they had been working with, whether it was on health research or other types of activities, and being able to work together. All these different components really came together seamlessly. Now, in the aftermath, it is a different conversation. You're right, because people are trying to recover, and you're in this acute recovery situation, and then it becomes an issue: is what can the state bring to bear, and if necessary, what can the federal government bring to the state to fill in the gaps? And people always find that, I thought we're just going to have this fantastic rescue, but it doesn't really work that way. I mean, the country's set up to do acute emergency response, but the long tail of these disasters is not just the acute event. It's like Cody mentioned, people left with their homes that are damaged, people left with the loss of income, people left with the mental health impacts, people left with children in schools and displaced members of their community. So there's all sorts of after effects that really do take an incredible amount of thinking and coming together and planning, and people need to be also understanding that what happens acutely is just the beginning of a recovery process that goes on for a long time, and for many individuals it may be years or maybe a lifetime, depending on the impacts.
Yeah, I would just start by saying there are so many organizations and people and professionals in Iowa that do have the expertise we need to prepare for these things. And I think that's a misconception sometimes, whether it's us at IEC or the Iowa Flood Center, or on the cancer side, the Cancer Consortium, the Cancer Registry. We've got a lot of great infrastructure in this state. It really sometimes is just about reaching out and being able to access those resources. And so this is part of what we hope to do at IEC, is be a bridge for some of those folks. And I'm going to use an example from Spencer again, because I think it illustrates this really well, Olivia, is, they had the flooding, and the city folks will tell you that, as Aubrey said, our federal response and our state response, they're designed to respond to individual trauma, essentially. They're like, okay, you have a house that's, flooded. You need a hotel room. Got it. Okay. You have a tree that fell down. You need some funding for that. Got it. But the city has to know, or the county, or wherever the disaster is, they have to tell the federal and state officials what they need. And that can be really difficult if that infrastructure, that community is not in place with those relationships before. They shared that they had some challenges with relatively new public safety officials, whether it was the fire chief or the police chief was out of town, or, those different things happening. It's not to blame any of those folks, but it's just that this had never happened before. And how do you plan for a 4,000-year rain event, right? Well, the answer is building those spaces for community both before and after. And I'll just note that as we've done this cancer project that I mentioned earlier, focused on the environmental risk factors of cancer across the state, the purpose of these listening sessions we've been holding, and we're having 15 of them in every corner of the state. In fact, we're having one right now as I speak in Waterloo. And the purpose of them is not really like, okay, let's share some data with you, let's get some outcomes. Like, sure, we get some of that stuff, but the purpose is community. And to start a conversation and relationships around these topics of, in this case, preparedness and health, and how you have those relationships. And that's ultimately what I'm trying to do more of, and I think the state would benefit a lot more of, in preparedness conversations, peer-to-peer learning, investments in the research, more training opportunities. All of these things make a lot of sense in our new reality when it comes to extreme weather. So I would just say that a lot of times the goal doesn't have to be how do we respond to a flood, but it's rather how do we build strong networks in our communities so that when something happens, whether it's a building collapse like happened in Davenport, or the derecho that impacted most of the state, or the flooding in Spencer, or the Greenfield tornado, these networks, these relationships, the community aspect of it are really what determine a community's ability to respond quickly and effectively. And then in the aftermath, focusing on community is the only answer. I mean, because everybody is dealing with this at the individual level, but if you don't have a collective way to respond to it, then how are you going to? One of the things that the Spencer folks asked for was, how do we have a model to use to deal with this community trauma? Because there's nothing right now. And the answer is there's nothing there right now at a comprehensive program level. So we're actually sending some of our listening session formats and all that, this is a little bit in the weeds, but, to them to be able to leverage that. How do you have a conversation about a community trauma if you don't build the space for it? And the answer is you can't. So we have to do a lot better, I think, collectively as a state, and really, I guess, nationally too, from Aubrey's perspective, on not just fixing the problem and moving on and pretending that the lingering impacts aren't there.
Yeah. I can give you one example of what we're trying to do, at least on the kind of the research side. So we have a program called Disaster Research Response Program that our institute has been leading at NIH. And what we've been trying to do is prepare our partners, our academic universities and researchers around the country to be able to help and respond and contribute their expertise, their experience, their knowledge, or even their skills to situations. And University of Iowa Environmental Health Sciences Research Center is one of the leaders in developing like a protocol, and IRB, the way studies are reviewed to allow them to include human populations for research, but to be able to think it through and try to field these types of surveys and tools and instruments for data collection much more quickly. The University of Iowa has used it a number of times and shared it with other states to help them be able to get out into the field, to collect information, to answer these questions that, that Cody was like, well, what's the water quality? What's the change maybe here? What might be the change in some of the issues in your home? How do we get that data? How do we get that information? And it's not available locally typically. We need to have others involved that we can reach out to across our states, across our municipalities in ways that, we can help. We can help. We just need to know that, we're partners with you guys, and to think about where these resources exist and how to invite others to the table.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add, I know we probably want to get to questions soon, but we also just in Iowa have a robust public health infrastructure, and we've got a robust emergency management infrastructure. We don't have a lot of coordination very well between them. And I would also say we have a non-robust environmental health infrastructure. We have county sanitarians, we've got, different professionals like that, but they're really limited. In fact, many counties share a county sanitarian that, they've got all the responsibility for well testing, for water quality analysis, for any of the sanitary needs for rural sanitation facilities. I mean, we've got all of this combined into one person a lot of times for, what could be 30, 40,000 people across a couple of counties. And then they'd ship off whether it's a radon test or a water quality sample for PFAS or nitrates to the state hygienic lab. And sometimes that can take a couple of weeks or a month. And, that's one person. And so, of course, that's not enough to fully understand what the challenges are, whether we're talking about extreme weather and the aftermath or things like cancer and the environment. So I think this is it's a key opportunity for growth, to put it in a proactive way.
Absolutely. Thank you. Circling back to a point that both of you made a few moments ago, but when it comes to resources that are available to Iowans and just people across the country, across the board, what resources and information is available for them, and how can they sift through disinformation when it comes through extreme weather and how it can affect human health?
Cody, why don't you start with local, and then I'll give them broader.
Yeah, I think, again, if you have questions at the local level for how anything weather related is impacting your community, your go-to should be your county emergency management. They will have the relationships with public health, with the utilities, with whoever you need to get in contact with. They likely have somebody they can call and get you in contact with. And I guess the same really goes for your elected local government officials, particularly your mayor, city council. They can get you plugged in. And I would just say the reality is a lot of times there's not enough information, right? There's not a robust plan or infrastructure in place that communities can plug and play. They're often building that infrastructure as they're doing it. I've heard quotes from people, one of which is, you don't know how to fly this thing until you're flying it. And I think that's a common experience, especially with our more rural counties and cities across the state. So, but they do have dedicated professionals at the emergency management and public health offices. So almost all of them have Facebook pages, phone numbers you can call, websites. That's the best information at the local level that you can get. I would say second to that is our state Homeland Security and Emergency Management Department and the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. They often will just take what the locals tell them and put them out a little bit further. But that's a good place to look during and after a disaster. And then lastly, at the federal level, there's at this point, up to this point, I hope it continues, just to insert a little bit of a futuristic perspective there, but the National Weather Service has done a great job. I know that they're severely understaffed at this moment and strained in some of their resources, but that is a fantastic source of information, and those professionals deserve a lot of credit for doing that in the current circumstances. So those would be the groups I would point to at the local, state, and federal level.
Yeah, and just to pick that up from Cody, and again, a lot of the federal resources are in a state of change, so we're still trying to figure out what that will look like and that landscape of available information and how communicates to communities across the country and what the needs may be. CDC has been a great purveyor of information about different hazards and about different types of actions to take in response to events. So that's always one of my starting points. The NIH has specific information about studies and research, and we have tools and resources, a lot of it aimed toward the research community, but there is also, information about hazards and exposures and disease, of course, and cancer and different types of things that put out across the NIH, as well as other agencies that will focus. EPA has traditionally had a lot of really good information as well for people that have environmental exposures and challenges and the types of things that they can do. So again, a changing landscape. We hope that those resources will continue to be useful and available to our communities.
I would add one more resource from IEC, which I know I've shown you, Olivia. We have our climate change and environmental health map that's available on our website that shows federal data that we've taken. We've isolated to Iowa, and that can be really helpful for a couple of things, especially if you're at the emergency management or public health office, or even a community foundation or local community-based organization writing a grant application. Having this information about what's my flood risk, what is our wildfire risk here, what's our air pollution look like, what does the wastewater discharge look like in our community, and then additionally, racial and demographic makeup of the community, existing health conditions, including chronic illnesses we've mentioned a lot here, like asthma, COPD. Those are all available on that map. So I'd recommend to go to iaenvironment.org and use that tool as a resource. If you have questions about it, feel free to reach out to me too.
Well, thank you both. I see we have a few minutes left in the session today, but one question that I typically like to end conversations like this on is, with respect to extreme weather trends that we're seeing in Iowa and across much of the United States and how this is impacting health, what within this topic makes you optimistic?
Well, Aubrey, do you want to go first?
Sure, I guess I'll try. Again, as Cody mentioned, we're seeing changing challenges in this space, right? That we're seeing more events and severity and frequency of different types of extreme weather events across the nation. So we need to rise, right? We need to address the challenges squarely and robustly. We need to do it with community and with active participation and involvement from our communities, understand their needs, to help them understand the risks, and to allow them to make informed decisions for themselves and their families. So I remain optimistic that, I think we're talking about these issues more and more. There has definitely been progress made of identifying and building information and knowledge and training in these spaces. We are at NIH now have a new program called Health and Extreme Weather program that we're going to continue to build and try to advance the research, not only to understand what are the health impacts, but the interventions, the type of things that people can do that work. Do you use filtration in your home if there's a wildfire? Does that work? Other things you can kind of do to measure and to reduce the impacts of the challenges or exposures from these events. So I am optimistic that we will continue to build and to fund and to create research and training for the next generation, the scientists and others, to work with health departments and communities to be able to do the analyses and sampling that Cody mentioned to help people put in new interventions and engineering controls or whatever is needed. So I am optimistic that we're going to continue to build on this. These issues aren't going away, and we need to face them squarely.
Yeah, I would say just from a personal perspective, what makes me optimistic, I mentioned that this is our newest program here at IEC that started a little over a year ago. In that year, what we've been able to do is just identify so many people across the state, and this is connections we had before, professionals we had before in our networks, including, you know, my own personal network. But those people are hungry for this type of information, because the good news about, you know, even in this political moment we're in, where climate is controversial, with some of the agency funding and those sort of things, the solutions and the preparedness are, one, within our control, and then two, the solutions are local. You can't have a national solution to flooding in Spencer, Iowa. You can't have a national solution for tornado response and recovery in Greenfield, or flooding in Cedar Rapids, right? These are things that impact communities at the community and neighborhood scale. And the people that live there are the ones that should have a say in how we do these preparedness planning operations and prepare for the future. So that's what gives me optimism, is every community that I've been to in the state of Iowa, which has been dozens and dozens now, and done this work, whether it's pollution reduction or climate change preparedness, extreme weather recovery. As we've done this, we've found so many eager professionals, whether they're emergency managers or public health or local elected officials or even state lawmakers. They understand that the people that live in the communities are being impacted by these things. It doesn't matter what causes them in that context. It doesn't matter if we agree on things from climate science to pollution or the causes or sources of those things. It doesn't matter. When we talk about climate resilience, in my book, what I'm talking about is how do we prepare for these things at the community scale. So what gives me optimism is all of the amazing people and partners that we've discovered in this work. And there are so many more in the state than people even realize. And there are so many of them that don't think of themselves as climate resilience folks or extreme weather professionals or even health professionals, but they are. And they start to see that as we have these conversations on the interconnectivity. You know, water utility professionals or energy grid operators or utilities, you know, those sorts of groups have all this expertise that is, you can't do this work without, and they are a critical part of that. So that's what gives me optimism, the eagerness, the people willing to be involved. We see that all over the state of Iowa, and I think people are hungry for more on this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for your time and insight for this session. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining today. And this was a great start to our week-long Iowa Ideas in-depth week, and a great start to our year-long Iowa Ideas program. So thank you so much. Just a few notes from me before we conclude. Please join us tomorrow at noon for discussions on how extreme weather will impact Iowa, specifically focused on the economic threats of extreme weather and climate change. Again, I just want to say thank you so much to our presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest. And thank you so much to our panelists today, Cody and Aubrey, for your time. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Cody, and thank you, Olivia, and the good folks at the Gazette. You guys have a great day.
Thanks so much. Same to you.